40 days under fire. That's how long the Marines at Khe Sanh had been holding a remote plateau in South Vietnam by February 1968. The ridges around them poured shell after shell into the base, smashing bunkers, shredding sandbags, and flooding trenches with mud. Blasts came from nowhere. Every shadow hit a sniper scope. Sleep came in stolen minutes between barrages. They knew 20,000 North Vietnamese soldiers surrounded them. They knew they were outnumbered 3-1. What they couldn't understand was why the final assault never came. A single coordinated attack could have overrun them in hours. The attack was coming, but Khe Sanh was just a decoy. In July 1962, a detachment of U.S. Special Forces carved a clearing from the jungle near Khe Sanh, a remote village only 7 miles from Laos. Their mission was twofold: monitor infiltration routes from the west and organize local militias under the Civilian Irregular Defense Groups program. The camp sat on the site of an old French fort, only 7 miles from the Laotian frontier, linked to the coast by Route 9. The high ridges surrounding it formed a natural amphitheater, the kind of ground a soldier knew instinctively could turn into a lethal trap. General William Westmoreland fixed on Khe Sanh as part of his broader strategy. In his view, the camp could block infiltration from Laos, anchor defenses south of the demilitarized zone, serve as a patrol and reconnaissance hub, and perhaps one day provide a jump-off point for ground operations to cut the trail. With that in mind, in 1966, he expanded the existing strip into a more capable airfield on the plateau, a step toward transforming the isolated outpost into something larger. Westmoreland soon demanded a permanent Marine reinforcement at Khe Sanh. His field commanders balked. General Lowell E. English declared that, quote, "When you're at Khe Sanh, you're not really anywhere. It's far away from everything. You could lose it, and you really haven't lost a damn thing." But when reconnaissance confirmed a major camp only 14 kilometers northeast, the debate ended. Marine KC-130s ferried in Lieutenant Colonel Peter A. Wickworth's 1st Battalion, 3rd Marines, reinforced with artillery. In January of that year, the PAVN struck Khe Sanh with 120mm mortars. They were testing the outpost defenses, gauging how the Americans would respond, and keeping the men on edge. The isolation of Khe Sanh, hemmed in by ridges and dense jungle, evoked memories of another remote outpost under siege, Dien Bien Phu, the 1954 battle in which French forces were surrounded and crushed by the Viet Minh in a remote northern valley. There, fortified airstrips and strongpoints could not prevent the French from being overrun once the enemy gained the high ground. In January 1968, CIA roadwatch teams, reconnaissance units, and aerial photo missions confirmed the worst. 3 PAVN divisions, supported by artillery regiments, were massing in the hills surrounding the base. Between 20 and 30,000 enemy troops now occupied the region, the largest concentration seen yet in the northwest corner of South Vietnam. The scale of the threat forced a stark choice: abandon Khe Sanh or reinforce it for the storm to come. Maxwell Taylor, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs and a senior presidential advisor, argued for pulling back. The base, he warned, was too isolated to hold. President Lyndon Johnson and General Westmoreland insisted otherwise. Khe Sanh would be defended at all costs. The defense of the combat base was given the code name Operation Scotland. General Rath von Tompkins, newly appointed commander of the 3rd Marine Division, fully supported holding the base. Reinforcements were sent. The 3rd Battalion 26 Marines occupied Hill 558 and Hill 55, providing fire support and blocking potential avenues of approach. In mid-January, nearly 6,000 Marines and Army troops were entrenched across the plateau. The combat base now featured the Marine Air Traffic Control Unit, command posts, artillery battalions, tank and anti-tank units, and fortified bunkers with deep trenches. Barbed wire, trip flares, and mines surrounded every approach. Route 9, the only overland supply line, could easily be cut, leaving resupply dependent entirely on helicopters and airdrops. The northwest monsoon threatened rain, fog, and mist, further complicating logistics. Privately, Westmoreland considered a grim contingency. If the outpost was overwhelmed, he wanted the option to use chemical or even nuclear weapons along the DMZ. Few were told of this plan, and all hoped it would never be needed. On January 20th, Hill 881 South was hit first. From the surrounding slopes, PAVN mortars and rifle fire tore into the bunkers, driving the defenders to cover as enemy troops advanced to within grenade range. To the east, Hill 861 shook under the weight of a coordinated attack. For a tense stretch, the position was partially overrun. North Vietnamese troops slipped through the wire and surged into the outer trenches, their outlines flashing in the muzzle bursts of AK-47s. Marines found themselves grappling at point-blank range, firing pistols, swinging entrenching tools, and driving rifle butts into helmets. Grenades rolled into bunkers, blowing sandbags apart, while flares burst overhead, casting the fight in a sickly white light. Only through furious counterattacks, launched squad by squad, did the Marines claw back the line. When the last rifle cracked and the last flare extinguished, Hill 861 still belonged to the Marines. Barely. Then came dawn. At 5:30 a.m., hundreds of shells, mortars, and rockets slammed into the Marine combat base, instantly flattening above-ground structures and sending clouds of dirt, smoke, and debris into the air. One of the first incoming rounds smashed directly into the No. 1 ammunition dump. Inside were stacked 1,500 tons of artillery shells, mortar rounds, and rockets. It was around 90% of the base's stockpile, more than 10,000 rounds. Shockwaves slammed through the base, hurling men off their feet, ripping helmets away, shattering sandbag walls as if they were made of straw. Shrapnel screamed across the compound, scything through bunkers and tearing into men who had thought themselves safe underground. 18 Marines lost their lives outright in that single detonation. 40 more were dragged bleeding into trenches as the inferno raged around them. Soon after, another shell struck a cache of tear gas, and the clouds quickly saturated the entire area, adding choking fumes to the dust and smoke. Visibility dropped to near zero. Men coughed, gasped, and stumbled through the debris-strewn trenches, fighting both the enemy and the environment itself. Hours after the first salvo, around 10 a.m., fires ignited another large stockpile of explosives. The ground shuddered violently once again, and the base became a nightmare of detonations, smoke, and screaming ordnance. After the barrage ceased, the NVA retreated, leaving Khasan momentarily silent. However, a series of explosives set around the base detonated in succession, catching the Marines off guard before they could breathe fresh air. For the next 48 hours, the ruins of Khasan continued to erupt, with secondary explosions sending columns of fire skyward. Even amid the chaos, the Marines managed to fire mortars and artillery against suspected enemy positions, calling in fighter-bomber strikes that tore into North Vietnamese batteries across the surrounding hills. The response was brutal. The PAVN scored roughly 300 direct heavy artillery hits on the fire base, turning the battlefield into a cacophony of explosions and debris. Colonel David Lowndes, commander of the 26th Marines, braced his men for what he expected to be a massive ground assault, but it never came. Instead, the North Vietnamese infantry shifted focus. At dawn, they targeted Khasan village, 3 miles from the main combat base, where 200 Marines and South Vietnamese troops were stationed. The 400-man battalion of the 66th Regiment launched 2 fierce attacks, met by overwhelming artillery and air support. Reinforcements sent by South Vietnamese units were annihilated, and by day's end, the village was evacuated and abandoned to the enemy. Yet despite this, the North Vietnamese maintained the stranglehold on Route 9, leaving Khasan isolated and dependent entirely on the tenuous thread of air resupply. The following day, the 1st Battalion of the 9th Marines took positions at a quarry, a mile from the western flank, detaching a platoon to occupy Hill 64. Inside the base, Marines labored feverishly to repair the massive damage from the initial bombardment. Ammunition was the most urgent concern. The first aircraft delivered over 130 tons of shells in just 2 days. Additionally, roughly 300 men of the South Vietnamese Army Rangers joined the defenders, swelling the base's garrison to over 6,000 personnel spread across the main compound in 7 fortified hills. Throughout it all, PAVN artillery continued its daily rain of between 150 and 300 shells on Khasan. Yet with American firepower, air support, and the grit of Marines and Rangers, the base held firm. In the United States, President Johnson grew increasingly anxious. Still, withdrawal was not an option. To hold Khasan, American commanders relied on the overwhelming power of the sky by implementing Operation Niagara. The first step was intelligence. Newly deployed acoustic and seismic sensors, part of the experimental Muscle Shoals program, soon to be renamed Igloo White, tracked PAVN movements along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. By January 22nd, 316 sensors had been dropped in 44 strings, feeding vital data to the Marines Fire Support Coordination Center. Roughly 40% of actionable intelligence came from these invisible eyes, warning of troop movements, artillery emplacements, and infiltration attempts. On the ground, the Marines worked feverishly to relay target coordinates to the sky. DASC at KSCB coordinated strikes with artillery fire, while a C-130 Airborne Command Center directed aircraft to FAC spotters, who in turn called in devastating strikes. Daily, 350 tactical fighter bombers, 60 B-52s, and 30 reconnaissance aircraft swarmed the skies. B-52 cells arrived every 90 minutes, dropping 27 tons of bombs each, while fighter bombers unleashed 54,500 tons of napalm over the course of the siege, triple the peak daily tonnage of World War II. Hills exploded into cratered moonscapes, forests vanished in pillars of flame. The ground trembled, trenches shook, and Marines felt every thunderous strike through the soles of their boots. The most massive arc-light raid of the war struck on January 30th, targeting a suspected North Vietnamese headquarters near Khe Sanh. 2 B-52s unleashed their payloads, obliterating bunkers, forcing enemy units into hidden ravines, and sending plumes of smoke spiraling miles into the sky. Amid this, political and doctrinal battles raged above their heads. Air Force General William Maumier pushed for centralized control, drawing sharp resistance from Marine Commandant Chapman and Army leaders. Westmoreland backed Maumier, pressing for unified oversight, and even hinting at resignation if opposed. The uncertainty of who controlled what only added another layer of danger. Some commanders believed the relentless artillery and aerial bombardment had disrupted the enemy's command structure. Others believed it was merely a pause, a deceptive calm before the massive ground offensive that Brass kept fearing would eventually arrive. By late January, the North Vietnamese gunners had become methodical, pounding the base from pre-positioned sites just beyond the Marines' reach. Hill 881 North bristled with rockets. Hill 305 and the Ko Rock slopes hid heavy artillery in caves, while closer mortars and shorter-range guns lay within 2 miles, ready to shred the perimeter at a moment's notice. The Marines returned fire whenever possible, their own artillery and mortars striking seemingly empty stretches of jungle to suppress enemy positions. Yet the heaviest enemy guns were beyond the range of their artillery. At night, when the NVA probed most aggressively, Marine guns lit the hillsides, echoing through the valleys as rounds arced skyward, stitching fire across the landscape. Sometimes, the suppressive fire was reinforced by larger strikes, radar-guided artillery coordinated with forward air controllers, or even scaled-down arc-light raids, where B-52s dropped tons of ordnance in concentrated patterns. Together, these bombardments could flatten entire ridgelines and erase suspected enemy positions. Early on January 30th and 31st, while South Vietnam erupted under the Tet Offensive, Khe Sanh remained eerily quiet. Defector reports suggested a major assault was planned, but still, nothing materialized against the base itself. Some commanders believed the continuous artillery and airstrikes had fractured the North Vietnamese command structure, though the truth remained uncertain. Convinced the main blow would fall in Khe Sanh, General Westmoreland held American forces in reserve elsewhere. By now, more than 2 weeks into the siege, over 150 rounds from NVA artillery struck the base daily, surging to 1,300 per day by February 23rd. Despite the constant shelling and lethal exchanges across the hills, the Marines held their lines, repairing trenches, reinforcing bunkers, and keeping watch through the smoke. They focused on survival above all else. Every man had access to a bunker designed to stop an 82mm mortar round, and command posts were reinforced to endure hits from 120mm shells. By February 5th, the electronic sensors around Khe Sanh picked up a massive NVA movement. The Marines barely had time to register the readings before squadrons of aircraft streaked overhead, Operation Niagara at its fullest. Despite these strikes, the enemy pressed forward. Hill 881 South had been blocked, but one Marine company at Outpost 861 Alpha confronted 2 determined infantry attacks head-on. Tracer fire cut through the darkness, mortars slammed into the jungle, and artillery rounds hammered follow-on waves. By dawn, the company had repelled the attacks, leaving dozens of NVA casualties smoldering in the craters and trenches. That night, the North Vietnamese 304th Division struck from the west. The American Special Forces camp at Long Bay became the first objective. Explosions rocked the compound as mortars and machine guns ripped through bunkers. Over 3 hours, the defenders fought desperately, but the NVA stormed the position with overwhelming numbers. When the smoke cleared, only 74 of the 400 U.S. and South Vietnamese defenders remained alive. Elsewhere, enemy infantry struck a nearby hill from 2 directions. Marines rushed reinforcements, hammering the attackers with artillery and airstrikes. B-52s and fighter bombers pounded the ridge, transforming it into a blazing inferno. Hundreds of enemy troops fell under the bombardment. Their assault was halted, but the threat remained, looming like a storm over the plateau. By February 6, the NVA had failed to capture any American hill outposts. Yet their strategic gains were clear. They had gained enough control over sections of Route 9 to move artillery reinforcements, including 130mm guns, allowing heavier ordnance to move closer to Khe Sanh. The siege was a daily test of endurance, ingenuity, and sheer logistical nerve. The Marines needed 160 tons of supplies each day to survive, all funneled through the perilous skies above the plateau. Above all, the supply effort depended on the huge load-carrying ability of the C-130 Hercules transport, each aircraft capable of carrying up to 20 tons of cargo. However, every flight was a gamble. Enemy anti-aircraft fire could slice through engines or wings, turning a routine supply run into a fiery trap. On November 11, 1968, North Vietnamese gunners achieved their first significant strike against a Marine KC-130, forcing the Americans to abandon large-scale landings and rethink the supply chain entirely. Smaller planes, such as the C-123 Provider and Marine helicopters, became the backbone of resupply, but without the Hercules' massive payloads, survival hung by a thread. As such, innovations were tested under fire. The Low-Altitude Parachute Extraction System, or LEPUS, had C-130s skimming mere feet above the runway as parachutes yanked cargo pallets into place. However, when the weather turned the clouds dark, the method failed, forcing supplies to be dropped into zones outside the perimeter, leaving men to scramble through mud, craters, and shrapnel to recover their lifeline. The hill outposts were the most dangerous positions of all. Nearly a fifth of Khe Sanh's defenders were stationed there, enduring constant probes and taking almost 50% casualties. Helicopters ferrying them food, ammunition, or reinforcements became lightning-fast targets for enemy mortars and anti-aircraft fire. For that reason, air commanders launched daring, tightly coordinated missions that combined Huey gunships, supply helicopters, airborne command and control aircraft, and Skyhawk fighter bombers. The Skyhawk swept over enemy positions, blasting and suppressing anti-aircraft fire, while helicopters darted in to deliver supplies. Entire missions were executed with such speed and precision that some were completed in less than 5 minutes. Life inside Khe Sanh was an unending grind. The roar never stopped, and dawn brought no relief. Artillery shells screamed from the surrounding hills, crashing into the plateau with a fury that rattled every bunker, splintered timber, and sent mud and shrapnel flying across the trenches. Between barrages, sniper fire stitched the landscape, forcing Marines to hug walls, crawl through cratered earth, and pray for a fleeting moment of silence. Every shadow could hide a rifle barrel, every rustle in the brush a potential ambush. Daily conditions were appalling. Bunkers were filled with filth and mud, overrun by rats, and the men could never forget that up to 20,000 enemy soldiers lurked just beyond the hills, waiting for the signal to storm the base. Rations trickled in, often shredded by explosions before hands could reach them. Water pooled in shell holes. Trenches became canals of filth. Sleep was a luxury, measured in stolen minutes, between incoming rounds or sudden night attacks. To keep the men from brooding over their possible fate, officers and NCOs kept troops busy digging trenches, filling sandbags, and reinforcing bunkers, tasks that were as much about survival as discipline. Patrols were stationed along the perimeter, never more than 500 yards from friendly lines, while vigilance remained constant. The North Vietnamese tested every weakness with infantry assaults of up to 200 men and stealthy sapper teams, while hidden machine gun nests could open fire at any hour, day or night. Morale teetered between exhaustion and grim humor. Letters from home, the occasional fresh ration, and the camaraderie of shared misery offered brief reprieves from the unending tension. The siege captured widespread attention in the United States. Journalists filed reports and footage that appeared regularly on network television, making the battle a vivid symbol of the war. Stories from Khasan accounted for 25% of all war news broadcasts on U.S. networks, sometimes 50% on CBS, sparking heated debate over the wisdom and risks of holding the isolated outpost. On the other hand, North Vietnamese media offered only carefully curated propaganda about the situation. Strict government oversight ensured that the public received minimal information, emphasizing heroic imagery and ideological messaging rather than the chaotic reality of the siege. By late February 1968, President Johnson and his advisors fretted over the secluded Marines, imagining worst-case scenarios: enemy poison in the water or covert bombing raids. However, even though North Vietnamese aircraft occasionally penetrated within striking distance of Khasan, they made no attempt to attack the base. American air defenses over the DMZ were far too strong. The biggest threat came from one of the most primitive weapons in warfare: the defensive networks themselves. The North Vietnamese had been methodical, painstakingly digging mile upon mile of trenches and bunkers that crept closer to the perimeter with each passing day. Already, a major system of fortifications had been established on Hill 471, less than 2 miles south of the Khasan base, and trench lines were extending northward at an alarming pace until they came within just 25 yards of the American perimeter. Another line of bunkers and trenches was advancing from the southeast, allowing infantry to mass under cover. During the last week of February 1968, few Americans inside Khasan doubted that a major ground assault would come soon. The moon was in its darkest phase, offering ideal cover for a night infantry attack that could overwhelm perimeter defense. Smashing the enemy trench lines became an urgent priority. Napalm and bombs rained down in huge quantities. Artillery barrages struck endlessly, but progress was slow. History had shown that it could take 1,000 hits to destroy just 100 yards of well-constructed trenches. The answer lay with the B-52s. On February 27th, under close radar guidance, strategic bombers released their payloads to within 1,200 yards of the base, reducing the trenches to rubble under concentrated bombardment. The sudden escalation of North Vietnamese activity left no doubt that the climax of the battle was near. A Marine patrol was nearly wiped out, while enemy traffic along Route 9 from Laos surged, signaling reinforcements and artillery were moving into position. By the night of February 29, 1968, the tension around Khasan had reached a breaking point. The 66th Regiment of the North Vietnamese 304th Division had gathered south of the base, near a plantation, while other units massed around an abandoned French fort. Under the cover of darkness, a battalion of the 304th swept toward the eastern edge of the camp. Their target, the 37th ARVN Rangers, the thin line holding the perimeter in that sector. American defenses opened fire. Artillery rounds slammed into the jungle as North Vietnamese troops pushed forward. Fighter bombers shrieked overhead, strafing and dropping bombs on advancing units, while B-52s pounded the enemy-held approaches, identified as main attack routes. At the perimeter, the lead NVA units were met with a calculated response. Artillery patterns formed the sides of an open box, and within that lethal corridor, a creeping barrage advanced, cutting down men before they could even reach the defensive wire. Despite the ferocity of the bombardment, the North Vietnamese pressed forward. Then, on March 6th, the momentum broke. The bombardment had turned the approaches into a wasteland, shredding the networks the NVA had spent weeks carving toward the wire. Exhaustion clawed the attackers. Mud-clogged boots, dwindling ammunition, and the endless roar of American firepower sapped their strength. At last, the advance stalled. Units that had crept so close to the perimeter could go no further. Many stumbled back into the shattered jungle, leaving behind a wasteland, pummeled by more than 100,000 tons of ordnance, the heaviest concentrated aerial bombardment on a single patch of land in the history of warfare. For 3 tense weeks, Khasan simmered under uneasy quiet. The large NVA assaults had stopped, but mortars, rockets, and artillery kept falling almost daily, shredding bunkers, kicking up plumes of dirt, and grinding down nerves. Out beyond the wire, a handful of North Vietnamese sappers kept pushing trenches forward, testing the perimeter under constant fire. Then, on March 22nd, the siege erupted again. At dawn, a massive bombardment shook Khasan, with hundreds of shells screaming down from concealed batteries in the hills. The Marines answered in kind with all their available forces. The Vietnamese trench line stalled under the weight of American air power. Positions carefully dug by hand were pulverized overnight by arc-light strikes. Patrols slipping too close to the wire were cut down by coordinated artillery patterns that left no way out. On April 1st, the Marines formally closed Operation Scotland. The siege was not over, but the base had held. That same day, Operation Pegasus began. It was a massive relief drive to reopen Route 9 and break the encirclement. The 1st Air Cavalry Division led the charge. Helicopters shrieked through the jungle, dropping fire bases like stepping stones, while Marines and ARVN units pressed west from Dong Ha, clearing the way through dense foliage and hidden enemy positions. By April 5th, Pegasus forces were clawing up the high ground around the base, storming fortified positions under a hail of fire. Hill 471 fell after fierce resistance, and the net around Khasan tightened. The NVA, unwilling to be trapped, began slipping back across the border into Laos. 3 days later, on April 8th, the link-up was complete. Cavalry troopers clasped hands with the 26 Marines, and the 77-day siege was officially lifted. Khasan had survived. As the smoke lifted, General William Westmoreland stood convinced that victory at Khasan had opened the door to something bigger. He envisioned a bold thrust into Laos, severing the Ho Chi Minh Trail at its heart, a move he believed could finally break the enemy's grip on South Vietnam. Back home, Washington saw things differently. The Tet Offensive had erupted while Khasan was under siege, and although American and South Vietnamese forces had crushed it militarily, the political impact was devastating. Images of burning embassies, chaotic firefights in Saigon, and the battered bunkers of Khasan convinced many at home that victory was slipping further away. Public opinion turned sharply against the war. Making matters worse, the toll of the siege had been staggering. U.S. estimates placed North Vietnamese losses between 10,000 and 15,000. American and South Vietnamese forces had lost over 1,000 men, and more than 4,500 were wounded, though under 250 of those casualties occurred inside the base itself. For the North Vietnamese, Khasan was still a propaganda and strategic win. By drawing massive U.S. forces into a remote siege, they tied down men and material, inflicted casualties, and helped distract American attention from simultaneous offensives in urban areas. On March 31, 1968, President Johnson addressed the nation. He announced there would be no widening of the conflict, no troop increases, no march into Laos. Instead, he promised negotiations, and days later, stunned the nation by declaring he would not seek re-election. Westmoreland's hopes for a decisive strike evaporated overnight. Khasan, the battle he had staked so much on, was left without a larger purpose. By June 1968, he ordered the base dismantled. Bulldozers and demolition teams tore through the bunkers, trenches, and airstrips the Marines had defended with their lives, revealing the changing character of the Vietnam War. Fire bases and fixed defenses mattered less than mobility and perception. Even as American units won tactically, the war itself was slipping into new terrain, especially since America's leaders admitted the war could not be won as they had once imagined.